home, crossed the river, made a wide detour at a gallop, and hitching his horse in the woods, came to the playhouse from the other side of the hill. And half an hour later, when the pale little teacher came out of the schoolhouse, he heard grunts and blows and scuffling up in the woods, and when he ran toward the sound, the bodies of two of his pupils rolled into sight, clenched fiercely, with torn clothes and bleeding faces, Bob on top with the mountain boy's thumb in his mouth, and his own fingers gripped about his antagonist's throat. Neither paid any attention to the schoolmaster, who pulled at Bob's coat unwaveringly and with horror at his ferocity. Bob turned his head, shook it as well as the thumb in his mouth would let him, and went on gripping the throat under him and pushing the head that belonged to it on the ground. The mountain boy's tongue showed and his eyes bulged. "'Nough!" he yelled. Bob rose and told his story, and the schoolmaster from New England gave them a short lecture on gentleness and Christian charity, and fixed on each the awful penalty of staying in after school for an hour every day for a week. Bob grinned. "All right, Professor, it was worth it," he said, but the mountain lad shuffled silently away. An hour later Hale saw the boy with a swollen lip, one eye black and the other as merry as ever, but after that there was no more trouble for June. Bob had made his promise good, and gradually she came into the games with her fellows thereafter, while Bob stood or sat aside, encouraging but taking no part. For was he not a member of the police force? Indeed, he was already known far and wide as the infant of the guard, and always he carried a whistle, and usually outside the schoolhouse a pistol bumped his hip, while a Winchester stood in one corner of his room, and a billy dangled by his mantelpiece. The games were new to June, and often Hale would stroll up to the schoolhouse to watch them. Prisoner's base, skipping the rope, ante over, cracking the whip, and lifting the gate, and it pleased him to see how lithe and active his little protege was, and more than a match in strength even for the boys who were near her size. June had to take the penalty of her greenness, too, when she was introduced to the king and queen, and bumped the ground between the make-believe sovereigns, or got a cup of water in her face when she was trying to see stars through a pipe, and the boys pinned her dress to the bench through a crack, and once she walked into school with a placard on her back which read, "June Bug." But she was so good-natured that she fast became a favorite. Indeed, it was noticeable to Hale as well as Bob that Carl Heaton, the mountain boy, seemed always to get next to June in the tugs of war, and one morning June found an apple on her desk. She swept the room with a glance and met Carl's guilty flush, and, though she ate the apple, she gave him no thanks, in word, look, or manner. It was curious to Hale, moreover, to observe how June's instinct deftly led her to avoid the mistakes in dress that characterized the groupings of other girls who, like her, were in a stage of transition. They wore gaudy combs and green skirts with red waists, their clothes bunched at the hips, and to their shoes and hands they paid no attention at all. None of these things for June, and Hale did not know that the little girl had leaped her fellows with one bound, had taken Miss Ann Saunders as her model, and was climbing up on the pedestal where that lady justly stood. The two had not become friends, as Hale hoped. June was always silent and reserved when the older girl was around, but there was never a move of the latter's hand or foot or lip or eye that the new pupil failed to see. Miss Ann rallied Hale no little about her, but he laughed good-naturedly and asked why she could not make friends with June. "She's jealous," said Miss Saunders, and Hale ridiculed the idea, for not one sign since she came to the Gap had she shown him. It was the jealousy of a child she had once betrayed, and that she had outgrown, he thought. But he never knew how June stood behind the curtains of her window, with a hungry suffering in her face and eyes, to watch Hale and Miss Ann ride by, and he never guessed that concealment was but a sign of the dawn of womanhood that was breaking within her. And she gave no hint of that breaking dawn until one day early in May, when she heard a wood thrush for the first time with Hale, for it was the bird she loved best, and always its silver fluting would stop her in her tracks and send her into dreamland. Hale had just broken a crimson flower from its stem and held it out to her. "Here's another of the wan ones, June. Do you know what that is?" It's she paused for correction, with her lips drawn severely in the precision. It's a mountain poppy. Pap says it kills goslings. Her eyes danced, for she was in a merry mood, and she put both hands behind her. If you're any kin to a goose, you better drap it. That's a good one, laughed Hale. But it's so lovely I'll take the risk. I won't drop it. Drop it, caught June with a quick upward look, and then to fix the word in her memory, she repeated, drop it, drop it, drop it. Got it now, June? Uh-huh. It was then that a wood thrush voiced the crowning joy of spring, and with slowly filling eyes, she asked its name. That bird, she said slowly with a breaking voice, sung just that away the mornin' my sister died. She turned to him with a wondering smile. Somehow it don't make me so miserable like it used to. Her smile passed while she looked. She caught both hands to her heaving breast, and a wild intensity burned suddenly in her eyes. Why, June, 'tain't nothin', she choked out, and she turned hurriedly ahead of him down the path. Startled, Hale had dropped the crimson flower to his feet. He saw it, and he let it lie. Meanwhile, rumors were brought in that the Falins were coming over from Kentucky to wipe out the Guard, and so straight were they sometimes that the Guard was kept perpetually on watch. Once, while the members were at a target practice, the shout arose, "The Kentuckians are coming! The Kentuckians are coming!" And at double quick the Guard rushed back to find it a false alarm, and to see men laughing at them in the street. The truth was that while the Falins had a general hostility against the Guard, their particular enmity was concentrated on John Hale, as he discovered when June was to take her first trip home one Friday afternoon. Hale meant to carry it over, but the morning they were to leave, old Judd Tolliver came to the Gap himself. He did not want June to come home at that time, and he didn't think it was safe over there for Hale just then. Some of the Falins had been seen hanging around Lonesome Cove for the purpose, Judd believed, of getting a shot at the man who had kept young Dave from falling into their hands, and Hale saw that by that act he had, as Bud said, arrayed himself with the Tollivers in the feud. In other words, he was a Tolliver himself now, and as such the Falins meant to treat him. Hale rebelled against the restriction, for he had started some work in Lonesome Cove and was preparing a surprise over there for June. But old Judd said, "Just wait a while," and he said it so seriously that Hale for a while took his advice. So June stayed at the Gap, with little disappointment apparently that she could not visit home, and as spring passed and the summer came on, the little girl budded and opened like a rose. To the pretty school teacher she was a source of endless interest and wonder. For a while the little girl was reticent and aloof. Miss Saunders felt herself watched and studied in and out of school, and Hale often had to smile at June's unconscious imitation of her teacher in speech, manners, and dress. And all the time her hero worship of Hale went on, fed by the talk of the boarding house, her fellow pupils, and the town at large, and it fairly thrilled her to know that to the Falins he was now a Tolliver himself. Sometimes Hale would get her a saddle, and then June would usurp Miss Ann's place in a horseback ride up through the Gap to see the first blooms of the purple rhododendron on Bee Rock, or up to Morris's farm on Powell's Mountain, from which, with a glass, you could see the Lonesome Pine. And all the time she worked at her studies tirelessly, and when she was done with her lessons she read the fairy books that Hale got for her, read them until Paul and Virginia fell into her hands, and then there was no more fairy stories for little June. Often, late at night, Hale from the porch of his cottage could see the light of her lamp sending its beam across the dark water of the mill pond, and finally he got worried by the paleness of her face and sent her to the doctor. She went unwillingly, and when she came back she reported placidly that organically she was all right, the doctor said. But Hale was glad that vacation would soon come. At the beginning of the last week of school he brought a little present for her from New York, a slender necklace of gold with a little reddish stone pendant that was the shape of a cross. Hale pulled the trinket from his pocket as they were walking down the river bank at sunset, and the little girl quivered like an aspen leaf in a sudden puff of wind.